You stand not in a city, but a crucible. Tenochtitlan rises from the water like a god's geometric promise, gleaming obsidian and white stucco reflecting the harsh, vertical sun. The air is thick, not just with humidity, but with the metallic tang of purpose, a relentless, systematic purpose that demands constant feeding. You see the markets teeming, the complex aqueducts working, the whole immense mechanism of empire humming with efficiency. But beneath this magnificent surface lies the true foundation, a belief system powered by terror and submission. You watch a procession winding toward the Templo Mayor, their steps measured, their faces masked by a mixture of reverence and dread. They are carrying a tribute, not of gold or jade, but of human potential, bound for a destiny woven by priests and emperors alike. What defines a civilization's relationship with its gods? Is it whispered prayer or something far more demanding, something that costs the deepest measure of human dignity? For the Mexica people, the cosmic balance was a fragile agreement, maintained only by constant, painful renewal. They feared the darkness and the cold, the possibility that the fifth sun might falter and fail, plunging the world into hungry oblivion. This pervasive anxiety justified everything. It fueled the expansion, the massive infrastructure, and the relentless cycle of conflict with neighboring polities. Every action, every conquest, every political decision was ultimately filtered through the imperative of the offering, the absolute need to keep the world turning for another day. Walk closer to the Great Pyramid. Feel the tremor in the ground beneath your sandals. The sound isn't shouting, but a low, rhythmic drumming, a heartbeat amplified by stone. The architecture itself enforces this mood. Steep, unforgiving staircases that ensure anyone ascending must struggle, emphasizing the distance between the sacred peak and the secular earth. This structure was designed not merely as a temple, but as a stage for cosmic theater, a constant, unavoidable reminder of who held the ultimate authority, the state, operating as the proxy for the divine. You realize that in this place, the concept of individual fate is utterly submerged by the overwhelming, demanding fate of the entire cosmos. The stakes were existential, not just theological. The state used the power of ritual to solidify its control over every aspect of life, from tribute collection to military service. The flow of offerings, human or material, was meticulously tracked, transforming spiritual requirement into effective political infrastructure. Conquered cities weren't just required to pay maize or cotton, they were required to supply the fuel for the rituals, binding them irrevocably to the imperial machine through shared dread and obligation. Failure to comply wasn't just treason against the Tlatoani, the ruler. It was a sin against the sun god Huitzilopochtli, ensuring both political reprisal and cosmic collapse. The true cruelty lay in the systematization of tragedy. Imagine a young woman from a distant Tlaxcalan village, captured during a conflict. Her name is forgotten by history, but her terror is immortal. She is brought hundreds of miles, not merely as a prize, but as a living commodity to be purified, ritualized, and prepared for her ultimate, tragic role. For months, she is treated with strange, paradoxical respect, a vessel set aside. This period of preparation served to dehumanize the individual, while elevating the role they were about to play, making the final act less about personal suffering and more about state-sanctioned necessity. It was a refined psychological manipulation that stripped away identity before taking life. Disraquatoni, the great speaker, was not simply a warlord. He was the primary mediator, the steward of this demanding cosmic economy. The burden of maintaining the empire, of securing victory in battle, and of guaranteeing the sun's return fell squarely on his shoulders. This immense pressure often drove policy toward relentless expansion, ensuring a continuous supply chain of tribute and captives. The constant need for conflict, the so-called flowery wars, was engineered to train soldiers and, crucially, to harvest the necessary raw material for the altar. It was a self-perpetuating system where power and piety were interchangeable tools of control, creating a culture simultaneously magnificent and deeply tragically dark. 10 years later, the shadow of these required acts would begin to darken the empire itself. The neighbors who had long endured the Aztec demands for tribute and captives nursed a profound and justified resentment. This simmering fury, born of systematic oppression and the violation of dignity, was the true structural weakness of the empire. When new, strange forces arrived from across the water, those subjugated nations did not see a foreign threat. They saw an opportunity for vengeance, a chance to break the chains of the crimson tax that had been levied against their sons and daughters for generations. The profound irony of the Aztec worldview was their meticulous attention to fate, coupled with a blindness to political reality. They interpreted omens, the strange appearance of comets, the sighting of a mythical bird, the reports of floating palaces on the eastern sea as purely theological signs, warnings from the gods that required greater ritual intensity, not geopolitical reform. Instead of strengthening alliances with peripheral states or easing the burden of tribute, they tightened the screws, believing that increased devotion would stave off the perceived doom. This theological tunnel vision was the ultimate strategic mistake, mistaking the political enemy for a divine challenge. Consider the priesthood, the ultimate arbiters of the system. They were not malicious caricatures. They were learned, dedicated astronomers and mathematicians who genuinely believed the fate of millions rested on their ability to read the calendar and execute the rituals precisely. Their dedication was absolute, which only amplified the horror. When a massive drought or failed harvest struck, the solution was never agricultural innovation or political negotiation. It was to increase the fervor of the offerings, demanding more from the people who were already starving. This betrayal of trust, where the protectors of the realm became the ultimate agents of internal depletion, created a moral canyon between the rulers and the ruled. You stand now in the shadow of Moctezuma II. He was a man steeped in tradition, a former priest, yet haunted by the responsibility of his office. He inherited an empire perfected in the mechanisms of control, but brittle at its seams. His governance was a constant balancing act between the demands of the gods and the grumbling of his distant vassals. It is a terrifying burden to be the most powerful man on earth, yet utterly subservient to a cosmology that demands continuous cruelty. The fear in his court was palpable, not the fear of external invasion, but the deeply embedded generational anxiety that the sun might simply refuse to rise, and that he would be the Tlatoani who failed to pay the cost. Presumption. The arrival of the outsiders, Cortés and his contingent, was not merely an event. It was the ultimate cosmic irony. The Tlatoani, bound by the rigid prophetic interpretations of their calendar, struggled to categorize this anomaly. Were they gods? Were they mere men? The indecision, rooted in the empire's own theological framework, paralyzed the response. Meanwhile, the subjugated nations, the Tlaxcalans, the Huejotzingo, the Totonac, made their own ruthless calculation. They saw not a confusing omen, but a swift, terrible weapon forged by foreign hands, capable of dismantling the hated system of the crimson tax once and for all. The narrative is not a battle, but a moment of profound psychological collapse within the imperial heart. When the strangers were allowed into the heart of Tenochtitlan, they did not immediately assault the military defenses. They struck at the ritual center. They defiled the sacred images, banned the public ceremonies, and, most damningly, severed the constant, necessary flow of offerings. For the common person, this was not just sacrilege. It was the ultimate act of cosmic negligence, threatening the very continuation of life itself. The ensuing chaos was the psychological realization that their sacred contract with the universe had been brutally, irreverently violated. You look at the faces of the priests during this defilement. Not rage, but a chilling, absolute despair. Their entire world order, the complex architecture of power and faith they had maintained for centuries, was collapsing, not under the weight of a powerful army, but under the weight of skepticism and cultural disregard. This emotional peak exposes the core vulnerability of the system, its dependence on universal, unquestioning belief. When the rituals stopped working, the power structure evaporated. The violence that followed, the eventual confrontation between the invaders and the people, was less about territorial defense and more about a desperate attempt to restore the sacred equilibrium, to force the sun back into alignment. The tragedy of the Noche Triste, sorrowful night, was a momentary triumph for the Mexica, a ferocious, desperate act of cleansing. But even as they drove the invaders wounded and battered out of the city, they failed to recognize the larger enemy they had unleashed, the internal fury of their own vassals. The allies of the Spaniards flocked to their banner, ready to endure any hardship, simply for the chance to see the Templo Mayor silenced forever. The accumulated injustice of decades, the cruelty of the systematic takings, the constant demands for ritual sacrifice had come home to roost, transforming the empire's victims into its deadliest executioners. The final siege of Tenochtitlan was a sustained horror, but the narrative focus rests on the starvation and the disease, not the steel. As the city choked on its own suffering, the ultimate act of cruelty was committed by the system itself, the failure of the infrastructure to sustain the population when the spiritual foundation was gone. The people suffered not just from foreign weapons, but from the inability of the Tlatoani, now reduced to a mere defender, to fulfill the most basic promises of kingship, protection, and sustenance. The immense beauty of the floating city became a cage of despair, demonstrating that systems built on terror are incapable of generating true resilience. The empire falls. The great city is dismantled, piece by deliberate piece. The stones of the Templo Mayor recycled into the foundations of the conqueror's cathedral. The old faith is officially replaced, but the silence that descends upon the central valley is not the peace of liberation. It is the quiet, heavy silence of cultural erasure and continued subjugation. The indigenous populations who helped overthrow the Aztecs soon realized the profound, chilling irony of their victory. They traded one system of demanded tribute and ritualized cruelty for another, equally demanding, equally exploitative power structure. The system of control had changed hands, but the essential mechanism of power, the extraction of resources and the violation of dignity, remained. The crimson tax simply swapped the altar for the gold mine, the sun god for the distant king. What remains for us, the quiet historians who look back across the centuries, is the reflection on how institutionalized fear sustains itself. The Aztec Empire, in its relentless pursuit of cosmic order and political dominance, inadvertently created the precise conditions for its own violent destruction. Its very strength, its highly centralized, religiously justified authority, became its ultimate, fatal weakness. We understand that history is rarely a simple battle between good and evil, but a devastating collision of different definitions of survival. The Aztecs believed they were ensuring the survival of the world. Their neighbors believed they were fighting for the survival of their people. The ensuing conflict created a tragedy of unimaginable scale, where both the perpetuators of the system and its victims suffered catastrophic, definitive losses. The immense, glittering achievement of Tenochtitlan serves as a permanent, ghostly monument to the fact that cruelty, however religiously justified or politically necessary, always accumulates interest and eventually demands an absolute repayment. This video is created for educational and historical purposes. It examines themes of power, corruption, and human conflict without depicting explicit or graphic events. And so, we are left with the paradox of history. How could a civilization capable of such immense mathematical genius, such sophisticated engineering, and such profound devotion also be capable of such systematic, cold cruelty? Perhaps the answer lies in the human capacity for justification, the ease with which fear can be weaponized into faith, and power can transform necessity into morality. The question remains, when we judge the past, are we truly horrified by the cruelty of the acts, or are we secretly horrified by how easily we recognize the mechanics of control, the chilling blueprint of power unbound? If this story made you reflect on how easily power turns to cruelty, stay with us. Subscribe for the next chapter from the darker corners of human history.